Pleased this afternoon to have an interview with Stephen Prothero. Stephen is a professor in the Department of Religion at Boston University, received his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Harvard University. He's the author of several books, including Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't, which was one of the top 10 religious books in 2007, was an editor's choice in the New York Times Book Review, and won the Quill Award in the category of religion and spirituality. His most recent book is God is Not One, 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. Dr. Prothero has appeared numerous times in National Public Radio and television, was on the Oprah show, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. It's been on NBC, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. He's a contributor to the Wall Street Journal and USA Today, and quite recently was on the Colbert Report, where he actually managed to get in a couple of words, only a couple of words given the interviewer there. So we'll hope that you have more chance to speak today than you had then. So welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks.
You bet. Our pleasure. So say a word about God is Not One, 8 rival religions and that run the world and why their differences matter. Why that book, why now, and why that title?
Well, the prior book I did was called Religious Literacy, and in that book I argued that the United States is one of the most religious countries on earth, and yet Americans know hardly anything about religion. They know very little about their own religions, and they know even less about the religions of other people.
Okay.
So what I was trying to do in this book was to say, okay, let's take these 8 major religions, talk about them, give some basic religious literacy of these traditions, and along the way make the argument, which is the main argument of the book, that religions are really quite different and that it's a mistake to see them as different paths up the same mountain. Even though there are similarities, we can't really make sense of the conflicts in the world or even of the unique beauty in each tradition without taking account of the differences across these major religions.
Okay, so you're taking a different tack than some pretty heavy hitters like Huston Smith and the world's religions. I mean, that's kind of been the tack that's been taken by probably most interfaith dialogue groups and so forth.
Right. I think among scholars, I don't think my view is particularly controversial, but many of the most popular books on religion over the last 50 years even have been reacting against this idea that religions are in a kind of perpetual conflict, and so we need to see the similarities and indeed understand that the religions are at the heart, at the center, in essence one. So we see this from people like Huston Smith, who argues that since there's really only one divinity, when you go up the mountain at the top, people are going to have a similar experience of God, or people like Karen Armstrong, who argues that compassion is at the heart of all the world's religions. This book says that what the religions share is a sense that there's a human predicament. But as soon as they start to define the human predicament, the human problem, they go off in very different directions. So Christians will define the problem as sin, come up with solutions to sin. Buddhists will define the human problem as suffering, come up with solutions to the problem of suffering. But that's taking them right away in very different directions.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to that, but say a little bit about your methodology. I mean, it's tough to define a religion. I also have a question in relation to why those 8. Some are obvious, but maybe not all. So you can kind of work in how you want to. But who defines? How do you define a religion? Who gets to define the religion? Is it? I mean, especially now it seems like religions, especially Islam, to many Americans, is defined by the extremists.
Mm-hmm.
What's your methodology for deciding across Christianity? There's so many different.
Right. My main approach really is to try to see how people inside the tradition, ordinary people, look at it.
Okay.
So instead of some people who have written about religions focus on the mystics, teeny portion in every religious tradition, and I say that doesn't make sense to me. I think you should look at ordinary practitioners. What do everyday people, everyday Christians in America, everyday Muslims in Indonesia, everyday Hindus in India, what do they do? What do they believe? What's important to them? So rather than letting the philosophers or the mystics define the tradition, I try to focus more on ordinary people.
Okay, and ordinary practices. And so you've done that by visiting various places and
Right. So
writings
I read a lot about each of these traditions. I, in many cases, visited key places. Was in Jerusalem. Was in Indonesia. Obviously, traveled around the United States, which is really my specialty, religion in America, and tried to talk with ordinary people about their own traditions.
Okay, and 8 religions, are these the ones that have the largest populations that believe in them, or is overall, or most
Right.
influential, or how do you define
Well, what
that?
I tried to do is, and I actually ordered them in the book, from the greatest to the least great, where great means not true or even necessarily powerful, but having contemporary impact. So the key for me was, which of the traditions in the world that have the greatest contemporary impact? And so I start with Islam, because I think that that's first. I go second to Christianity, and then I go to Hinduism. There's a little bit of controversy about why Islam is first, because there are more Christians in the world than there are Muslims. But the Christian population is actually declining in the world over the last century. And from about 35 to 33%, the Muslim population is increasing from about 12% of the world's population to 22% over the last century. So Islam is growing very, very quickly, and Christianity is decreasing somewhat slowly. And at the same time, Islam is really controlling the conversation. When I travel around the United States and I talk about religion, nobody asks me about the Yoruba religion. Nobody asks me about Judaism. People ask me about Islam.
Okay.
So that's where I start with those three, the big three.
Okay.
Which, by the way, is where I was intrigued to follow President Obama this week. Went from the country with the most Christians in the world, the United States, to the country with the most Hindus in the world, India, to the country with the most Muslims in the world, Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Was that intentional?
Well, I think in part, I think he has been keen to go to Indonesia to speak about Islam and to make the point that there are a lot of moderate Muslims in the world, which is a point that I make in my book, that it's a mistake. You asked about extremists before. It's a mistake to let any religion be defined by people who are either on the far left or on the far right, or in the case of extreme violence, to let those people define the tradition. I think by going to Indonesia, talking about Islam there, which is pluralistic, which is democratic, which is compatible with the modern world rather than seeing itself at odds with the modern world, it's able to point to really a success story in terms of the modernization of Islam.
Okay. So you talk about differences and why their differences matter. Say more about why those differences matter. You talk about we can learn more about our world, about politics and so forth, if we see the differences in the religion. What political issues today, what in the last election did you see as influenced by religion?
I think where I start with why the differences matter is I start, again, with ordinary people. Okay. So in order to make the religions the same, it requires a leap of the imagination. In other words, what you have to do is you have to look at the things that are obviously different. Like, Christians say Jesus is God. Human can take a divine form, or divine can take human form. Well, Muslims reject that. They don't think Jesus was God. Jews reject that. They don't think Jesus was God. They don't think a human being can be God. So in order to make that the same, you have to say, well, that doesn't matter, right? Or in Islam, you say you have this emphasis on the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Christians don't do that. Hindus don't do that. You have to say, well, that doesn't really matter. Or, Hindus will say, okay, well, really a big part of our tradition is doing puja in front of the god in the temple, where we have a sense of sort of intimate encounter, eye-to-eye encounter with the divinity who's behind the image. Well, Christians don't really do that, especially Protestants. That doesn't really matter. My approach is, if it matters to ordinary people, it matters. So don't try to condescend, as I see it, to ordinary practitioners in terms of their beliefs and practices. So why do differences matter? Because they matter to ordinary people who see the differences across the traditions. Why else do they matter? Well, because we can't make sense of religious conflict what's going on in the Middle East if Judaism, Christianity, Islam are essentially the same? I mean, they're so obviously not essentially the same. You know, this is a view that I heard in college a lot and in graduate school. It never made any sense to me because it didn't make sense of the world. Look at Kashmir, where we now have a powder keg. Sandwiched there between the Muslim majority state of Pakistan, the Hindu majority state of India. Religion matters there too. Religion matters in Myanmar, it matters in Sri Lanka, it matters in Tibet, it matters in China. So we can't understand the conflicts in the world without knowing something about the differences. And finally, we can't see the unique beauty of each of these traditions if we don't see the differences. I mean, if we hear so much about diversity and the virtues of diversity, etc., but if you wish away the religious diversity into a kind of a mush, then why should I read, Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching if it's going to just repeat what I learned growing up as an Episcopalian on Cape Cod? Is it just a redo of what I already heard? If I talk to my Jewish friends, is that just a redo of what I was told as a kid? That hasn't been my experience. My experience has been these traditions are going off in very different directions, very different sense of the human predicament, and very different scriptures, very different practices, and it's intriguing to look at those. And the challenge of religious tolerance is to, and mutual respect, is not to pretend those away, but to see them as they are, and then somehow accept them and maybe even celebrate them.
Well, I certainly respect that perspective, and one of the struggles I have with interfaith dialogue is that it tends to be, we cover over the differences, or people are afraid to offend or to ask the questions, right. or if the church that I pastor is doing a course on Islam, and it's very well done, but if I was doing one on Christianity, it would be the idealized version of Christianity, and that's, so our people are back saying, well, do all Muslims do this? I mean, right. Or do they, slack off as much as we do?
Right.
And if we can at least get to that level of, questioning, but so I think that's, it's really important. That the struggle is, of course, when our history, there's so much conflict, religious conflict, and at least, my experience of Christianity is so much, it's our way or the highway, that difference means deficient.
Right.
And so, the questions raised, what's to be served by, it's a fairly sophisticated move to be able to really see and then appreciate the difference.
Yeah, I think you just need to get it. You say that, well, difference means deficient. I think the point to attack is that. In other words, I think that there's an odd way in which the religious lumpers who are seeing the religions as essentially the same are buying in a way to the clash of civilizations argument. The clash of civilizations argument says there's fundamental differences between Christianity and Islam, and therefore the Christian West and the Islamic world are fated to collide. They're fated to fight. Because why? Because they're different.
They're different. I see.
So why is that? In our families, we don't have the sense that our children are exactly the same. We don't have the sense that our spouses are the same as us. Is that a recipe for, a good marriage to say, my spouse and I are exactly the same? No. We try to look at how we're different, right? And figure out how to accept that and how to get along with that. We know our political arrangements, when we look geopolitically around the world, we know that there are different political and economic arrangements in other countries, and we don't imagine that we can't get along with them economically unless they have the exact same economic structure as ours. Why do we do this in religion? And I think you pointed out, we do it because we're trying to avoid religious war. We do it because we have a memory of where religious difference has caused conflict. But I think the way to address that is to say, we have religious difference, how can we have it to not cause conflict? In other words, start with reality, rather than starting on the basis of what I think is really a fraud, which is this sort of pretend pluralism that the religions are basically the same, where somehow you're trying to contort all these religious people into positions that they don't own. And I think the old-fashioned interfaith dialogue, which I call Interfaith 1.0 in the book, it is this idea that you can come in the room if you will just agree before you show up that there's no difference between Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism. But the new model, I think, is to say, and this is where I look to groups like the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago. It's run by Ibu Patel,
right.
Where they're able to get evangelicals and Orthodox Jews and Muslims in the room, because they're not saying you have to leave your religious distinctives aside. Bring your distinctives into the room.
Right.
Let that be part of the stew, part of the diversity.
Right.
and we'll work together on a service project. That seems to me a really good model.
Yeah. So the evangelism is left at the door, pretty much.
Yeah, the evangelism is left at the door, but I think it's okay for people. There aren't a lot of rules, in other words, with that. And it's also focused not on talking as much on doing.
Right, on doing together.
So it's easier to get people to agree because there is a lot of common ground on ethics and service. Have people agree to work together. And then as they're working side by side, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and in many cases also atheists, they're able to talk about, where do they get their sense of duty? Where do they get their sense of service? And then some theological things can emerge. But the point isn't to sit in a room and argue to agreement.
Right. And I think your point that the paradigm is the same. If you're concerned about conflict, then you start there, and so it's either you're in conflict with other religions, or you're so afraid that you're going to be that you try to level that all out. And the issue is more being able to truly see what's going on and hopefully, if not, at least tolerate, if not, appreciate those differences without giving up your own. But I want to go back to the statement about, say, in the Middle East, and obviously religion matters there. But in so many places where there are conflicts or struggles, they have religious labels. But how? I mean, religion is so easily hijacked, has been. So how much? How much of those are religious differences? How much of those are historic rivalries that have become, that now have religious labels? I mean, it's pretty much impossible to separate the religion and the history and the culture, isn't it?
Right, I agree with that. I think it's naive to see the conflict in the Middle East as purely religious. It's also naive to see it as purely political or purely economic. We don't have a beaker, we don't have a world we can compare where there's no religion and people just act on the basis of greed and power, just on the basis of economics and politics. So religion and culture and politics, they're always tied up. And I think that what we've tended to do, because of this idea that a lot of social scientists have had, I think until recently, and they're happily giving it up because it's wrong, is we've been going on this secularization thesis idea that, religion's kind of going away. So gradually, as societies modernize, we can understand them purely as political and economic arrangements, and we can bring that analysis to bear. I think increasingly we're seeing that's not true. And we need political scientists and economists to help us understand what's going on in the Middle East? Absolutely. But we also need religious people. We need religious experts. We need people to say, what's at stake with Judaism in Israel? What's at stake with Christianity and Islam in the Palestinian territories? Those people are motivated in part by notions that this land has been given to them by God. I mean, now, are there some people who say, oh, here's this religious idea, I can use that because I want this land? Of course there are people who do that. And of course there are religions that are hijacked by political movements. There's no doubt about that. But I think that only shows the power of religion rather than its impotence. I mean, it shows that religion is a kind of force that people do want to draw down. If you can say, here's my political movement, follow me, that's one thing. But if you can say, here's my political movement, follow God, that's a lot.
Sure.
That's a lot more powerful. And so we have to understand the people who are listening to that and following God by following Him. What's going on with them? If we want to intervene in those societies, whether it's economically, politically, militarily, culturally. And unfortunately, we haven't done that. We send off ambassadors to India who know nothing about Hinduism. We send off people in the foreign service who don't speak the language, don't understand the religion of Iraq, of Afghanistan. So much of our troubles with those wars have been rooted in the fact of our lack of understanding of Islam, our lack of understanding of the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims. So religion is a powerful force in the world. It's a powerful force for good and for evil, and the only way to understand the role it plays in the world is to know something about its particular forms.
So in that sense, there would be certain political movements that have hijacked certain religions that other religions might not have been susceptible to. I mean, I'm thinking, in Islam, certainly Christianity has been hijacked. I might make the point that it's regularly hijacked in the U.S., certainly very much so. Islam has.
I mean,
is Hinduism as susceptible? Is Buddhism as susceptible?
I think they're all susceptible. And I think that the way I like to think about it, I think the language of hijacking has a little of sound of, this is a really good religion, and it's being used for a bad purpose. I think religions are good and bad both, all of them. And they almost don't need to be hijacked to do bad things, because there's bad stuff inside them. So I prefer to think about, what are the resources inside a tradition for good, and what are the resources inside it for, for violence. And I think that it's a responsibility of people inside these religions, people who call themselves Christians or Muslims or Hindus, when people hijack their tradition, when people use them for evil purposes, to say to themselves, what is it inside our tradition? What is it in our Bible? What is it in our Quran? What is it in our tradition of jurisprudence? What is it in our, teaching from the Talmud, or in our stories of the Buddha, or in the Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism, that's pushing people to do these horrible things? And they're doing them in the name of Jesus, in the name of Shiva or Vishnu, or in the name of the Buddha. And when they do that, we have a responsibility to intervene. I think to sort of wash your hands and say, the people who flew those planes into the Twin Towers, those weren't Muslims. I think that's an evasion of responsibility. Those people were motivated by their understanding of Islam. And Muslims have a responsibility not only to denounce that, but also to look at what are the resources inside our tradition that's causing people to do these horrible things. Because we know in our tradition it says, don't kill non-combatants in war. Don't kill Muslims in war. Don't kill women and children. So how can we, and similarly, Christians need to look at the legacy, say, of the Holocaust. What contributed in terms of Christian practice, in terms of Christian scripture, in terms of Christian rituals, to the mass extermination of Jews and other people? It's not enough to say, those people in Nazi Germany, they weren't Christians, because good Christians don't do that. I think that's an evasion also of responsibility.
And you make a point in your book about incoming, or some of your classes, and forcing them to read, or at one point forcing them to read Germany around Hitler and the Christian.
I would have my students read
theology.
Nazi theology.
Yeah.
I did that when I was teaching in Georgia State in Atlanta.
Okay.
I remember some parents were wondering about that. Why are my students reading Nazi theology? But I thought it was important for them to see the ways in which, especially in the Bible Belt, to see ways in which Christianity had been used by smart people who were reading the Bible in this very odd way for some pretty dangerous and horrible purposes, and to wrestle with that.
And I think your point there was, what is it? It's the same thing. What is it in our? It's not just those are bad people, but what is it in that faith that is susceptible to that?
That's right. That's right. And all these traditions, there was a big debate after 9/11. Is Islam a religion of peace? Is Islam a religion of war? I just thought that debate showed our incapacity as a nation of Americans to talk about Islam intelligently, because we didn't know anything about it. So we just had, demagogues on either side who were giving us these either fluffy or scary readings of Islam. And of course the answer is Islam is a religion of both. I mean, there's no religion that's around for 1,000 years that doesn't know how to do war and peace. I mean, if you don't know how to do war, you're going to be exterminated. And if you don't know how to do peace, no one's going to want to, be inside your tradition. So Christians know how to do war and peace. Jews know how to do war and peace. Muslims know how to do war and peace. When I was in graduate school, I used to think Buddhists were the exception, but we lived through almost a generation of civil war in Sri Lanka.
Right.
between Hindus and Buddhists there, and so Buddhists have a lot of resources for a kind of pacifism. So do Christians, but Christians developed pretty quickly a just war tradition that would enable them not to get pulled down the rabbit hole of pacifism, so that they could do war and expand their influence.
So you talk about it's not only demeaning to various religions to make them all the same, but it's dangerous, and that we've gotten into some of the issues and struggles in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. And we don't understand the war on terror if we don't understand something about Iraq. What would we do? Would we have done differently in Iraq or Afghanistan? How would we understand the war on terror differently if we understood more about Islam?
Well, I think we might not have gone into Iraq or Afghanistan, because I think we might have asked the question, what's different in that country from our country? I think we had this sense, very naive sense, very dangerous sense, and this is where the religion shades over into political ideology, that all human beings are the same and they all want democracy. And the democracy they want looks pretty much like what we have. And that's just not true. Americans are Americans. They're not just generic human beings. We have our unique ways that we look at Christianity. We have our unique ways we look at democracy. And so it was naive of us to think that. It was also naive of us to think that there weren't some fundamental differences between Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Americans who were going to be engaged there, who would be largely Christians. And it was also perhaps the greatest naivete was not understanding the distinctions between the Shia and the Sunni there. Not understanding, in other words, that as soon as you took off the impress of the power that we were overthrowing, that all of a sudden you were going to bring out these ancient disputes inside the tradition. We didn't understand that. I mean, it was astonishing to me after being, in Iraq for years and years and years. All of a sudden, we were saying, "Oh my gosh, Sunni and Shia, they don't like each other."
But it's not though that a lot of us weren't saying that was the case or was going to happen. But there wasn't there wasn't a large enough majority of people who were willing who understood that. Certainly, politicians didn't or chose not to understand that, to exploit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big irony that, one of the biggest complaints of the left about George Bush, President George W. Bush, was that he was so religious that he was making all these decisions on the basis of religion. And yet when it comes to this, the most monumental decision of his presidency, it seems that religion actually wasn't taken into account. In other words, it seems as if the assumption was that, okay, this is a place that can be understood in terms of economics and political science. These are people under the yoke of oppression. This is an economy that's corrupt. This is a place that may have weapons of mass destruction. But what about the religion factor? Like, what about, okay, how is this going to work? Are we going to be seen as Christian invaders? Is the memory of the Crusades going to come back? Are the Sunni and the Shia going to go after one another? All these religion questions that might have, raised red flags about unintended consequences. All these things that might go in a different way from what was planned. I think that's just a key case of poor diplomacy by religious illiteracy. I just don't think we know enough about these traditions to really factor them in, and it's a huge gap in our understanding of foreign affairs and our geopolitical awareness. And it's a gap for us at home as well. When we look at these politicians who talk to us and say, okay, here's my view of immigration reform. It's rooted in the Good Samaritan story. Or here's my view of the economy. It's rooted in my understanding of Jesus loving the poor. Or here's my view of abortion. It's rooted in the Bible. Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about abortion,
or family.
Yeah.
Traditional family.
Yeah, right. I mean, so we have the traditional family, and much of the Bible is polygamous, so we wouldn't, use that. So I think we have a religious literacy gap on the domestic front. We now have two political parties who are pretty regularly invoking religion, the Bible, but we can't really check them to see if they're doing it for kind of cynical political purposes or if they really are motivated by this particular passage, because the journalists among us and the ordinary citizens don't know enough to talk back.
Yeah, indeed. In the last short period of time, is there one or two things that you can say that, given we're in interfaith dialogue in lots of places, we touched on that before, but what will make that, what do people need to ask of each other or come to the table with again to help that be more real, to get more at the realities?
I would say talk to me about your tradition. I mean, an open-ended sort of question, what matters to you? Okay. I mean, the question that I pose is, in the book of each tradition, or a few questions is, the baseline is, what's the human predicament? Something's gone wrong. There's no religion that says, everything's perfect here. We're good to go.
And you say that's the common starting point.
Right. So everybody's saying there's something wrong. So I think a good starting point is to say, what's wrong, and how do you want to fix it? I think another big question is, what is the human being? What are we supposed to be as human beings? I think that, again, we have a tendency to imagine the answers are the same, but when you look at the religions, they're offering very different senses of what it is to be a human being. I mean, Muhammad was and is an exemplary human being in Islam. He was an administrator. He was a military leader. He was a jurist.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus wasn't a jurist. Jesus wasn't a military leader. Jesus wasn't an administrator. He wasn't a politician. They're two very different notions of exemplary human being. The Buddha leaves his wife and his children, and he wanders off around India, and he sits around and meditates. These are three very different visions of what it is to be human. I think that's a really interesting conversation, to ask our Buddhist friends or Hindu friends or Muslim friends, Jewish friends, what is it to be human? I think the Jewish understanding is much more familial, I think that's one of the shocks in a way of Jesus in the Jewish tradition, that he didn't have a family, he didn't have children, something weird about that.
And he's critical in some ways of that, of the family of that.
That's right.
There.
And same with the Buddha. We're supposed to admire this guy who quits his job and runs away from his wife and leaves his son behind. And then in the Confucian and Taoist traditions, Confucianism, you become human by becoming social, by integrating yourself into your family, to your society, performing your roles, being dutiful as a father, as a son, as a bureaucrat. In the Taoist tradition, you become human by becoming natural, by leaving behind those social roles. Very different.
Indeed.
Go out into nature, wander around. Now, in China, they integrate that a little by, often they talk about, well, we're Confucians in the work week, and then we're Taoists on the weekends. But so that would be another question. What is the ideal human being in your tradition, and see where that goes.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Well, thank you very much for this dialogue, for this book. God is Not One. Wonderful book, very, very helpful. I think you quote Max Muller in the book saying, "He who knows one knows none." I think to know our own selves and to know all the other religions, the major ones, better is certainly important. So appreciate your work and your previous books as well.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.